Hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. Am I in focus? I'm not sure. We're on the 18th day of July 2019. It's really good to be with you today. I hope you had a good 4th of July. Mine was spent with 2 weeks of bronchitis, so I was down on the 4th of July. I was also down the week after, but I'm feeling really, really good today, and we're here to bring you another jam-packed, fast-paced information overload. We are going to start off with our Prager University segment. It is a fine time to become an American.
I picked a fine time to become an American. It was a gray, overcast morning in Oakland, California. I was one of 1,094 people of every color and creed from 85 nations, beginning with Afghanistan and ending with Yemen. We had gathered, anxiously clutching the requisite documents, outside the rather antique Paramount Cinema. I wasn't the only new citizen of European origin, but we were a distinct minority. Rather to my surprise, the Chinese were the most numerous group, accounting for close to a fifth of the new Americans. How many Americans became Chinese citizens that week? Next were the Mexicans, more than 150 of them, then the Filipinos, closely followed by the Indians. Yet it was the sheer range of countries represented that was most marvelous. The young man to my right, immaculately dressed in white, was from Eritrea. He had studied computer science in Wales and had initially come to California to work for NASA. I approach any encounter with US bureaucracy weighed down by dread. So, I wondered, would this be like the Department of Motor Vehicles, famed for its Soviet-style antagonism to the public? Or would it be more like the implacable, pitiless Internal Revenue Service? In fact, the officials of the US Citizenship and Immigration Services could hardly have been more affable. The Master of Ceremonies was a genial, balding, bespectacled chap who won his audience over with a virtuoso display of multilingualism, chatting to us in what sounded like pretty fluent Spanish, Chinese, French, Hindi, and Tagalog. Yet this was very far from a multicultural occasion. Quite the reverse. To get us in the mood for our impending Americanization, a choir sang a patriotic medley, including a rather baroque setting of the preamble to the Constitution, Yankee Doodle, and Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. Well, that did it. The way that song conjures up vast American landscapes, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, always gets me by the throat, because, glimpsed in films, such vistas were what first drew me to the United States. Then came the information about our rights and obligations, specifically our right to vote, our option to obtain a passport, and our inextricable link to the Social Security system. Nothing, rather disappointingly, about the right to bear arms, and not a word about the spiralling federal debt we were all now on the hook for. The ceremony then became more stirring. A Faces of America video had a distinctly martial soundtrack. We raised our right hands to swear the oath of allegiance, absolutely renouncing all allegiance to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, and swearing to bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by the law. Then we placed our right hands on our hearts to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the national flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It's heady stuff, even in Oakland on a Thursday morning. And then there he was, the President of the United States himself, much larger than life on the big screen. This country is now your country, Donald Trump told us rather sternly. Our history is now your history, and our traditions are now your traditions. And that wasn't all. You now share the obligation to teach our values to others, to help newcomers assimilate to our way of life. Compare and contrast with the Barack Obama version. Together, we are a nation united not by any one culture or ethnicity or ideology. The grand finale was God Bless the USA, a country music anthem by Lee Greenwood, made famous following the 9/11 terror attacks on New York and Washington. It too was a call to arms. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died who gave that right to me. More than half a century of being British has made it hard for me not to cringe just a little at this kind of thing. But this hokum is now my hokum, and this president is now my president, until such time as we the people vote in another one. Yes, I picked a fine time to become an American, because it's always a fine time. I'm Neil Ferguson, Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video.
And that is the way it is. It is a very fine time to become an American. I say this because of things going on politically. We seem to have a few elected officials who are Americans who keep bad-mouthing the very country which allows them to become leaders in our own government. And there's a large flap about that going on right now. We're really not going to discuss that because there's another time we had that was really fine to be an American. And that happened, something happened 50 years ago. And no, I'm not talking about Ted Kennedy driving a car over a bridge in Chappaquiddick in Massachusetts, killing Mary Jo Kopechne. That incident actually occurred 50 years ago today, the Chappaquiddick incident. We're not going, other than what I just told you, we're not going to even talk about that today either, because this is the week of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And if you've watched this show for any great length of time, you'll realize that the Apollo program is something that is really special to me and to a lot of our viewers. So that's really what we're going to be looking at today, is commemorating and observing the 50th anniversary of the first steps that man had taken on the surface of the moon. So we're going to take a look right now at one just background piece, minute and a half. This is actually put together by RT, which is from the Russian government, and they were Russians, the Soviets back then. They were our big adversaries during the space race, which led up to Apollo 11. But this is what they put out in commemoration of the 50th.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
Up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
And so that's just to kind of get us in the mood here. That is really what happened. That is a very brief synopsis. But in part of this commemoration, of course, NASA has been doing a lot of things. And one of the things that they have done is a reunion at Rice Stadium in Houston, Rice University. Rice University football stadium was the place for a big speech brought out by President John F. Kennedy in was it September, October of 1962. That's where he made the, we're going to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very famous speech. So that's where NASA had chosen to have a reunion of flight controllers and various technicians who worked on the Apollo 11 and the Apollo program, not just Apollo 11. And so we're going to take a look at another brief thing on the reunion at Rice Stadium that happened this last week.
Greetings from the International Space Station. I'm NASA astronaut Nick Hague, along with my NASA crewmate, Christina
I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself. We're not going to do the reunion at Rice Stadium. We're just going to play this back to back. We actually have something that NASA put together with two of the astronauts who are currently aboard the International Space Station. So as we kick in for the 50th anniversary commemoration, we're going to start it off with astronauts currently doing the job. And then what we'll do, because I've already set up the piece, we'll go right into the Rice Stadium reunion.
Greetings from the International Space Station. I'm NASA astronaut Nick Hague, along with my NASA crewmate, Christina Cook. As we conduct world-class research on this orbital laboratory, we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of humankind's most epic achievement, Apollo 11's historic lunar landing and the first footprints on another celestial body by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin.
As we think back on this achievement 50 years ago, we remember the drive and sacrifice by the flight teams, engineers, astronauts, and many others that allowed the dream of Americans landing on the moon by the end of that decade to become a reality. At that moment, the world was one, awestruck by that accomplishment.
We are in that time again as we approach the 20th anniversary of a permanent human presence on the International Space Station, working hard to return humans to the moon in 2024 through the Artemis program. We've learned so much more about human spaceflight since Apollo 11. We've learned how to build laboratories in space. We've learned how to work and how to live in space, paving the road for future deep space exploration.
The legacy of the Apollo program is enduring and will guide us on our future endeavors in space. So, on behalf of the crew of the International Space Station, we hope you'll join us in celebrating the 50th anniversary of that giant leap for all mankind as we look towards the next giant leap on our endless journey to the stars.
So NASA is here at Rice Stadium today to film a video that we're working on for the Apollo 50th anniversary. Okay, action! We're trying to show all of these different generations and these different positions of people at NASA who have helped kind of build NASA into what it is today. We have about 45 Apollo alumni coming out today, about 100 Johnson Space Center employees, and other retirees coming out.
I think it's great being here at Rice Stadium where President Kennedy made that great speech back in September of 1962, which was really an inspiring speech about going to the moon. And coming here today and meeting a lot of the people that really made it all happen is it's a great reunion and a great place to have the reunion here at Rice Stadium.
I was about in the 7th grade when we were sitting in class, and all of a sudden the teacher comes running into the classroom. Everybody up, everybody up. And so we all got up, they hustled us out to the bus, and we got on the bus, and somewhere along the line we learned we were going to go listen to the president. So we went out to Rice Stadium, and they had us come off the bus, get into the stands, and we all sat prim and proper, just like we'd always been taught. When I look back on it and see the importance of what he was saying at that time, and then for me to graduate from school and go to work in the space program, it means a lot more to me now. That I was there, I appreciate being there.
I worked on all the unmanned and manned Apollo missions through Apollo 12. Then I started on Space Station Prototype, which was the development of the Regenerative Life Support System. I got called back on 13 to help work the CO2 problem. We were zeroed in on our subsystem. That was our job, to get it ready. Everybody else, all the other subsystems were in the same boat. All this stuff about beating Russia to the moon and all was at the upper levels, you know, and they were controlling what we did. But it was our job to get our subsystem ready and certified for flight.
Group action. NASA's goal right now is to move forward to the moon again in 2024. So, you know, these guys who were part of the last mission to the moon and the first mission to the moon, they're going to get to be here today to celebrate that we're going to go back, and we're trying to move forward to go back to the moon in 2024.
And did you notice what she just said? We're looking forward to going back to the moon in 2024. We'll see if that actually happens. I'd like to see it, hope it happens, but I can tell you this, that we are not going to be committing 4.5% of our entire federal budget to another moon landing. So exactly how this is going to work, I don't know. But 50 years ago, they put in a lot of money. I mean, the maximum amount of our federal budget, the entire year, about 4.5% of it, went into the NASA budget. And if you take a look at the vehicle assembly building, the huge beam-off that assembled the Saturn V rockets, if you look at the vast expanse of the launch pads, the mission control features, just the huge complex, that all cost a lot of money. All of the 400,000 technicians and other people who worked, you know, that's a lot of money on the payroll. That was a huge undertaking, and we succeeded 50 years ago. I don't know that right now, between now and 2024, we are going to commit the resources necessary to have anything of that scale. The nice thing is that we have actually continued to do things with the Lunar Reconnaissance Satellite, the LRO is what it's called, that platform, a few other things that we've done, which can actually cheapen the cost expenditure-wise. A lot of the facilities from 50 years ago have been modernized or are still functional, so there's not a lot of new construction that needs to be done. We know how to do it because we've done it before. You just need to upgrade the technology and the systems and things like that. So can we do it? Yes. Did the 4.5% of what we put in 50 years ago help? Of course it did. We still get some buyback on that today. But it's still going to be a huge expense, and I don't know that we've got the capability. So until then, we're just going to sit back and enjoy the accomplishment that we had half a century ago. And with that, back in 2012, the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong, had passed away. He had heart surgery in the beginning of August, and then he had complications, and he passed away from those complications. And yet even then, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin, his two crewmates, were talking about how it would have been nice to have had Neil together at the 50th anniversary reunion in 2019. So Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin were supposed to actually have a reunion at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida, for the anniversary of the launch on July 16th. Buzz Aldrin didn't show. Buzz Aldrin did something over in Los Angeles, and Michael Collins, who was alone in the command module circling the moon while Neil and Buzz were on the moon, was once again alone for Apollo, a part of the Apollo 11 mission. This time it was the commemoration. So what we are going to play right now is an interview with Michael Collins, the command module pilot, that was taken on Tuesday at the 50th anniversary of the launch. Here you go.
Good morning. I'm out here at the pad 39A with command module pilot Mike Collins. Mike, it was 50 years ago this morning that you and Neil and Buzz headed out here to launch to be the first humans to set foot on the surface of the moon. What thoughts were going through your mind on the way out to the launch pad?
Well, you know, as I came out on the launch pad today and got settled in.
Can you hold the mic up?
Yes, and as I came out today and settled into this comfortable chair, it was a wonderful feeling to be back at Launch Pad 39A. It was a difference this time. I want to turn and ask Neil a question and maybe tell Buzz Aldrin something. And of course, I'm here by myself, but at any rate, I know they would enjoy joining into this sort of a conversation as much as I'm looking forward to it.
So did you find it different coming out for Apollo 11 compared to your Gemini 10 mission?
I think the flights of Gemini 10 and Apollo 11 were quite different in one way. Of course, we rode up on a rocket, so that part was very similar, but the Gemini program got a lot of publicity, some of it worldwide, but nonetheless it had more of a local character. It was almost like a celebratory sort of event, like perhaps an athletic contest, whereas Apollo 11, on the other hand, was serious business. We crew felt the weight of the world on our shoulders. We knew that everyone would be looking at us, friend or foe, and we wanted to do the best we possibly could, put our best foot forward, and that required a great deal of work on our part, but not too much time left over for any of the things we might have more enjoyed.
Absolutely. So having the weight of the world on your shoulders, I know you guys went through an extensive amount of training. Can you tell us a little bit about the training? How did it prepare you for the mission?
I think the simulators were the heart and soul of our training. They were very good machines. They were excellent duplicators of what we would see in flight. Their one failing was that they couldn't duplicate particularly well the view out the window that we saw, but 99% of our work throwing switches and communicating with Houston, 99% of our work, we really didn't need to simulate the view out the window with great fidelity. And so the simulators were very powerful instruments, and we spent a lot of time in them. I think the command module simulator, I spent over 600 hours in it just preparing for Apollo 11 alone.
What did you find the most challenging?
Well, I always think of a flight to the moon as being a long and fragile daisy chain of events. Links in that chain, certain finite points along the route have names for them, like is going faster than escape velocity and slowing down into lunar orbit and so forth. But the point is, no matter how well things are going for you, you can't just relax and pat yourself on the back and say, well, isn't this wonderful? You have to say, okay, I got 17 down. What's number 18 coming up here? I better get on the ball and worry about it. So for me, at least, maybe it might have been different for someone else, but for me, at least, the flight was a question of being under tension, worrying about what's coming next and what do I have to do now to keep this daisy chain intact.
So you guys were down here supporting the vehicle processing. You were training in simulators. You spent a lot of time in Florida. Was that a challenge for your families? And how did the families react to you going to the moon?
Well, different families reacted in different ways. The way it was with my family, with three young children who should not be uprooted from their schools. My wife, Pat, stayed in Houston, and I was by myself here. Some crews imported their family from Texas to Florida, and that worked out well for them. But we used a different system, and it worked out very well for us.
So we had a chance to visit crew quarters this morning, and we were in the dining room and the rooms where you stayed, and the suit room and everything. Did it bring back any memories? How long were you in quarantine before the flight?
You know, I don't know how long we were in quarantine before the flight. You know, quarantine was sort of a bureaucratic stamp that had been put on some piece of paper. It didn't really change too much our normal training routine, and I think we were in quarantine maybe 2 weeks, but if there's a historian out there, I'm sure that he or she will correct that number.
Did you get a chance to see an Apollo Saturn V launch prior to yours?
Yes, I did see. I saw not an Apollo Saturn, but I saw the first Saturn II launch, 501, and I will always remember it. We had pretty good seats for that. We were about, I'd say, between 2 and 3 miles away, which sounds like forever and a day, but when you're looking at a Saturn V, you certainly find out in a big hurry that you're pretty close to it. The thing ignites, it takes off, it's very, very quietly, starts ascending, and you look out across the lagoon and you say, well, it's not a big deal. I've seen rockets go off before. And then it starts going up and picks up speed, going faster. It looks a little bit more impressive, but still nothing very exceptional. And then the shock wave from the rocket power hits you in the viscera. Your whole body is shaking. Your feet underneath you are shaking in the mud. And you think, my God, this is what they mean by power. This gives you an entirely different feeling, a different concept of what power really means. So you have to be there and have your belly shake before you can really evaluate a Saturn V.
So did you get a chance to strap into the vehicle in practice before you actually launched? I mean, the first time you strapped in, that wasn't the first time.
No, I don't think so. I think we'd been inside the vehicle quite a number of times. Going way back, our command module, 107, I had nursed it through the assembly process in California. And so it and I were old friends, and then I very graciously I invited Neil and Buzz to come aboard under certain circumstances that I was going to be the czar of the trio. But I invited them in, and then we had various exercises that prepared us to do our separate duties after launch.
I think we're going to get a video here, and we're coming up on the exact time of launch, and let's take a look at this video that's coming up.
We've accomplished a successful mission if we land men on the moon and return them safely. I believe that is the primary
20
mission,
seconds and
as stated.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts.
Main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Apollo 11 was about exploration, about taking risks for great rewards in science and engineering, about setting an ambitious goal before the world.
We find for the first time that man has the flexibility or the option of either walking this planet or some other planet, be it the moon or Mars or I don't know where. And I'm poorly equipped to evaluate where that may lead us to.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing.
Perhaps the highlight for those of us in the LEM will probably be a successful touchdown. I really look forward to that the most this time.
So, Mike, does that bring back any memories? You talked about what it was like watching a Saturn V launch. What did it feel like to ride that rocket?
The feeling on board a Saturn V after engine ignition is quite different than what you might imagine. If you watch it from a distance, it makes a stately ascent, and you're quite aware of the gigantic power it is producing, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. But inside, it's a different situation. Inside, you're not worried about your power so much as you're worried about your steering, and you're suspended inside the cockpit, not too far away from that launch umbilical tower that's right off to one side. As you lift off, if there's any imbalance, it's compensated for by the swiveling of your motors below you. You have 5 engines down there. And as you ascend very slowly, majestically inside, it's a different situation. You feel jiggling left to right, and you're not quite sure whether those jiggles are as big or small as they should be, or how much closer they're going to put you to that launch umbilical tower, which you do not very much want to hit right that moment. So it's a totally different feeling at liftoff. The nervous novice driving a wide vehicle down a narrow alley, and then once you clear the tower and things smooth out a bit, pick up speed, then it becomes more like you might imagine watching it from afar. You're more conscious of the gigantic amount of power below you. You're more conscious of the acceleration and the speed that you're picking up, and then you soon find out that your machine, your Saturn, breaks apart into pieces. When it's finished with piece number 1, jettisons it, and that gives you a momentary skyrocket inside the cockpit. The cockpit is immediately full of not any fire or flames, but the vision, the idea, the sight of being surrounded by fire. Then when it gets through that little hiccup, from then on it's a quieter, more rational, silent ride all the way to the moon.
What did it feel like when that second stage lit? Was that a pretty good kick?
Second stage was a stage that we had worried about somewhat during its birth and genesis. They had some, the designers and the engineers had some difficulty with the second stage, and we were a little bit leery about how ready was this second stage for manned flight.
Mm-hmm.
But it was perfect, smooth as glass, much smoother than either the first or the third stage, and so it was our friend that day.
50 years.
And that one abruptly cut out. I even missed the cutoff on that one, but that's a little bit more about Michael Collins. And I find just watching that little segment myself, and I've watched a lot of stuff about Apollo 11 and the whole space race, and just his description of the jiggling of the rocket and the swing and the fear of hitting the umbilical tower, that's actually new information to me. So I'm really appreciative of astronaut Michael Collins sharing that with the larger audience out there, including the North Star Oasis audience. But right now we're going to take a look a little bit differently at the aspects of manned spaceflight, because hearing from the astronauts, that's one thing, but how about the people who put them there? And I'm talking about mission control. A couple of years ago at Oshkosh at the EAA AirVenture, I had a chance to listen to Gene Kranz. He was one of the flight directors during Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 and Apollo 15 and Apollo 17. He had all of the odd-numbered Apollo missions. And he was just a fascinating man to listen to. I'm actually reading his book right now titled Failure is Not an Option. I just kind of figured with Apollo 11 anniversary, that's a good subject for me to read about. So I'm about halfway finished with his book, but I wanted to make sure you have an opportunity to hear about him, talk about being inside mission control. So we're going to play right now an interview with Gene Kranz inside mission control.
50 years ago today, 3 astronauts took off from Cape Canaveral and started the 4-day journey to the moon. And make no mistake, it took a lot to get a man on the moon.
Yeah, it took money, commitment, passion, and it took the man that you're about to meet. Marcelino Benito talks to NASA legend Flight Director Gene Kranz.
Okay, people, listen up. He's a living American legend, immortalized in Hollywood film.
I believe this is going to be our finest hour.
This room here has been home.
From inside Mission Control, former NASA flight director Gene Kranz helped land American men on the moon. 50 years after the historic Apollo 11 landing, Kranz is back in the room where humanity's greatest feat unfolded.
When I walk into the room, I don't have to relive it. As soon as I walk into this room, this seems crazy, but I hear things.
Kranz was already a rising star at NASA when he heard President John F. Kennedy challenge the nation.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It was a great time for America, and Kennedy's speech, I think, ignited the fire. Let's go do it.
Next stop for them, the moon.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Kranz watched Apollo 11 blast off into space.
Now you're accelerating down there, and you can almost feel it. I believe 100% that we're going to be successful. We're going to land that crew on the moon.
You're looking good.
4 days later, on July 20th,
we are all arrived here early dawn.
Kranz and his team of controllers walked into Mission Control with a lunar landing within reach.
Nobody can come in or out until we have either landed, we have crashed, or we have boarded. Those are the only 3 outcomes from now on. And it's now between me and my team and the crew in the spacecraft. They're the only people that exist in the universe.
For the next few hours, the Apollo 11 astronauts faced daunting challenges. Mission Control worked each problem.
It was a battle. We had problems with communication, we had problems with navigation, computer program alarms, etc.
Every solution got them closer to the surface of the moon.
We're going to make this the first manned lunar landing.
More forward, drift into the right a little. Listen, the Eagle has landed.
With just 47 seconds of fuel left in the tank.
And we're getting a picture on the TV.
Boy.
We're going to be busy for a minute.
But the people in the viewing room recognize we landed, and they're stamping and clausing, and they're stomping their feet.
The world celebrated, but Kranz and his crew still had work to do.
Okay, T1, stay, no, stay. Retro, stay. Fido, stay. Guidance, stay.
We celebrated 2 hours after the landing.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. The surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
Finally looked up and could see the moon up there. You could see the thing up there and say, hey, we just landed in the moon. That's pretty cool.
The success of Apollo 11 was way more than cool. It remains the defining moment in human history.
People started believing in themselves and what they can do.
Now at 85 years old, Kranz still finds himself captivated by the moon and its mystery. This NASA giant believes the moon is still calling.
To me, it's out there. And it basically says, I'm still here. Come and get me.
What an inspiring interview. You've had the chance to meet him.
A couple of times. Great guy. He inspires you, all over again for the mission to space and beyond. I love this story. He likes to tell this story when he talks to people. Back then in 1969, the other engineers, they called him Grandpa. That was his nickname. He was 35.
Look at him now.
He was 35. They called him Grandpa. That's how young everybody in that room was who put us onto the moon.
That's amazing. And great to see him doing so well and talking with so much energy.
I know. Love him.
Incredible.
And so now we are going to take a closer look on July 20th, 1969. I can't remember who it was, but somebody had actually pieced together the video and the audio and put them all in the sequence, the time sequence from back in 1969. They did this about 4 or 5 years ago. And so we're going to take a look at what's called the go, no-go 1201 alarm, which occurred 102 hours and 42 minutes and 5 seconds into the mission in the elapsed time. And so what you're going to see here is the video is going to kind of piece in and out because they don't have video for the entire 102 hours, but they've lined up the video sections that they do have. So you're going to see Gene Kranz, you're going to see a couple of the other controllers in real time. This is only a 1 minute clip, but this is right, I believe, as they were. I can't remember if this is the go no go or the stay no stay, but I think this is when they're still descending. But you're gonna see what it was like in mission control in real time in 1969. Let's take a look.
Manual attitude control is good.
Roger, copy. Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
Copy.
Alarm. 1201. 1201.
Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same type, we're go.
2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag, 47 degrees.
Roger.
47 degrees.
Okay, apparently, okay. All right, I don't know what happened there, so anyhow, we're just going to go on. Speaking of the Apollo 11 50th anniversary, Buzz Aldrin, he had some profound words to say in Los Angeles at an event Tuesday night. So let's take a look at what he had to say.
I could give you a number of examples where I ended up being one of the most fortunate people because it didn't look like it was going to come my way, being an astronaut. As we were coming down, all the commanders had decided they did not want the computer to make the touchdown. So there was a control system where you could take over at 500 feet and begin to see how it responded, and then begin to direct it where you wanted it to go. 50 years ago, the Saturn V took the command module, the lunar module, 3 of us to the moon. We landed, explored, got back up again, rendezvoused, came back. That's 50 years of non-progress. I think we all ought to be a little ashamed that we can't do better than that. There was a little uncertainty, and I don't want to go into all the details as to whether the training that was required for the commander during launch and then coming back and at the moon, he made the landing and he would make the ascent. Just like previous flights, the experiments were given to the co-pilot. So it didn't require, well, now we got a big experiment that's outside.
Houston, you're looking good.
And that was Buzz Aldrin. One of the things that happened during the final descent of Apollo 11 onto the moon was a computer error. The computer was taking out too much information, and they had 1201 and 1202 alarm codes. And so we're going to take a look right now a little bit more about the story behind the computer error. And I wish I had the clip. I don't have it handy. I wish I had the clip of Gene Kranz talking about this at Oshkosh a couple of years ago, because the way he presented it was really enlightening. But I hope we can get that same level out of this clip as well.
Good for separation. You're a go for separation, Columbia. Over.
On July 20th, 1969, just moments after the Apollo 11 lunar module began its descent to the moon, a warning light flashed in the cockpit.
1202. 1202 alarm.
1202. Standing by.
The spacecraft's computer had overloaded and rebooted, and no one knew why. As Houston scrambled to find an answer, an anxious Neil Armstrong requested more information.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
Back on Earth, few were more nervous than a young computer programmer who had written the code for the lunar landing.
We were landing on the moon the first time. It's not surprising there were problems. My name is Don Iles. I wrote a good part of the computer code for the onboard computer that was active during the lunar landing phase of the Apollo mission.
Iles' career at NASA began as a happy accident.
This was the summer of 1966, and I'd just turned 23. I was walking back home from a rather dispiriting interview, I think, at an insurance company. At that point, I would have taken any job that anyone offered me. When I happened by the MIT instrumentation lab and walked in cold and asked for a job.
He had never written a line of code. Even so, Iles was offered a position. That day, he joined an army of over 400,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians working on the most ambitious engineering project in human history.
No one knew how to land on the moon yet, just as no one knew how to, program the computer, and we would figure out both.
Hello. Today, we're at the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, which has been given design responsibility for this guidance and navigation system, which will direct our Apollo spacecraft on the way to the moon and back.
In 1969, this was the most sophisticated machine ever created. Before Apollo, computers had mostly been vast behemoths, often taking up entire rooms or floors of buildings.
When you say this computer is very much like land-based computers, and yet I think of them as occupying whole bays of equipment. You've got all this squeezed into a little box. How did you do that?
What was revolutionary about the Apollo computer was that it was the first use of integrated circuits, which allowed for a much smaller and faster machine.
The computer was 1 cubic foot. It was roughly 6 inches by a foot, about 2 feet, and weighed, I believe, about 70 pounds.
Despite these advancements, the Apollo computer's limitations presented formidable challenges.
We were dealing with a computer that was very limited, both in terms of its memory capacity and its operation speed. What this book in front of me is a listing of the flight code for the lunar module for the Apollo 11 mission. This represents the contents of 36,036K words of memory.
To give you an idea of just how small 36K of memory is, an average email message today is about 75K.
Ultimately, for flight, the information in a book like this would be woven into a type of memory called core rope that was super reliable. The result of that was 6 modules, like the one in my hand, and these modules would be slid into slots in the back of the computer. And that would be the code. That was equivalent to plugging the CD-ROM into your early Mac.
Memory was so precious. The code that Iles and his colleagues wrote had to both do its job and also do so in as few characters as possible.
When you write a piece of code, you're writing something that needs to, in as few words as possible, convey an idea, but at the same time it needs to fall trippingly off the tongue of the central processor. You could call it a lapidary sort of art, in the sense that you were dealing with small things and trying to get them just right.
So what was happening during Apollo 11's landing when the computer was overloaded?
1202 alarm.
1202. Standing by.
The computer's display was flashing error codes 1201 and 1202, but the astronauts didn't know what those alarms meant. And for 50 years, neither has much of the world. It all happened so fast. Not even the programmers who designed it were sure just what was happening.
There are many new things that are happening in this flight. There are big dangers involved, despite the best our technology can do, and our technology does do very well.
Right here you see the 1201 and 1202 codes. At the time, we were sort of holding our breath. You know, what is going to happen next? You know, is the spacecraft going to keep flying okay? Or is it going to somehow go out of control?
They got a momentary alarm on their system.
As the spacecraft began its final descent to the moon, a terrified Isles came to the conclusion that the mission was doomed.
There was a pit of the stomach feeling. If it had been up to me, I probably would have recommended an abort.
But flight controllers in Houston had a better perspective. Soon after the alarm started, Mission Control realized that the computer was still running the critical guidance and navigation systems.
Same type, we're go. Eagle Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Rather than abort, they made the courageous decision for Apollo to proceed. Neil Armstrong took over control of the craft, and Apollo, of course, landed safely on the moon.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
There was no sense of blame. There was no one calling and saying, you fools, what did you do to us? But there were questions being asked. It was up to us to figure out what had happened.
The alarm issues were traced to an obscure condition in which a radar, accidentally turned on, flooded the computer with unnecessary data.
The alarms were saying there's no more storage space. We're going to flush everything and sort of reconstruct it, do what you would call a restart.
Isles' code wasn't bad. On the contrary, it had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The issue was caused by human error in the hardware. Someone had accidentally flipped a switch when it shouldn't have been flipped.
It was determined that, in fact, the switches were set up in such a fashion that this weird condition could occur.
For his part, Isles stayed on at NASA, and his code was deployed successfully in every Apollo mission.
What was developed was actually extremely advanced for the time, and in some ways it's more advanced than some of what's being used today in real-time systems. Because the greater speed and greater memory of today's computers don't force you to be as compact as we had to.
And so that's the story of the 1201 and 1202 codes. Here's the one thing that I had since learned as far as, you know, like with Don Isles saying he would call an abort on that part of the mission if it were up to him. Here's what Gene Kranz explained at Oshkosh a couple of years ago. He said that during their simulations and their exercises, it was determined that they wanted to know and study every single type of alarm code that could possibly be triggered during a mission. And they had done this like a week or two before. And it was a flight controller named Steve Bales who took the lead on that project. And Bales had a little book, you know, it's just a little cheat sheet that he kept with him in mission control. And as soon as the alarms went off, Bales reached out for his book and looked at the 1201 and 1202 alarm codes, understood what the problem was, and while they were still descending, and if you actually heard, you know, they were talking, you know, really quick about what's the alarm, 1201, 1202, we got a 1202 alarm, they're all talking about what the alarm is. Bales is looking this up to find out what the answer was. How did they test this in the simulations? Is this something to really worry about or not? And it was Steve Bales who determined that this is just the computer getting overloaded and that they'll still be able to actually make the descent, ignore the alarms, take it over manually, they can make the landing. And it was Steve Bales who had figured out how that part of the lunar module guidance computer was operating. And without Steve Bales and without Gene Kranz and without the trainers and the controllers having tested all of this, Apollo 11 would not have been a success. And so 50 years later, we're celebrating the success, but it's important to note that it almost ended in failure because of a computer error, but it was Mission Control that saved the day. And so with Mission Control, we're going to take a look right now, probably our last segment. NASA Johnson Space Center had just reconstructed and opened the old Apollo-era Mission Control, and we're going to take a look at that. And what you were just watching there was the way the mission control looked before, and then a little bit on the restoration. But because there's no narration there and we're running out of time, I really don't want to spend too much more time on that, because we do have one last little thing coming up here. How has Apollo, the Apollo project, impacted your life? It actually has, through the use of technologies. And so we're going to show one last clip to explain.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down, 220 feet. 15 forward.
All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff on Apollo 11.
Dave, an extraordinary television picture here.
And this is exploration at its greatest.
This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Okay, Houston, as I stand out here in the wonders of the unknown at Hadley, I try to realize there's a fundamental truth to our nature. Man must explore.
For Dallas Pearson producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. 2 more days to the 50th anniversary of the moon landing.